By the time the coffin rope burned Barbara McCarthy's palms in St. Jude's churchyard, she had learned not to flinch where Lady McCarthy could see her. Rain had been falling since dawn, the thin, hard rain that found the seam of a glove and slid down a cuff, and the church bell had rung with a patience that felt almost cruel. Barbara stood at the edge of the open grave in wet black bombazine, dark hair escaping beneath a bonnet she had mended twice by candlelight, and kept her eyes fixed on the lowering coffin as if she could hold it level by force of will. The rough hemp slid against her skin through damp kid leather. The sting was immediate. She did not move. Around her, black umbrellas leaned and shifted, boots sucked at mud, handkerchiefs lifted to eyes that had been dry all morning. There were cousins she had not seen in years, neighbouring rectors, 2 magistrates, a widow from York whose smell of violet water arrived before she did. All of them had known her father as a practical man, cautious with credit and exact in figures, and now all of them looked politely past his elder daughter toward the woman who had survived him by 6 days and already wore authority like armour. Lady McCarthy did not cry. She received condolences with a bowed head and a voice tuned to tremble at the proper note. "My husband was goodness itself," she said. "His heart gave out under burdens no man should bear." Then, with a little press of gloved fingers at Barbara's elbow, she added in tones designed to carry, "And this is Barbara, the girl my husband insisted on keeping." The girl! As if Barbara were a cracked escritoire dragged from his first household and never worth the cost of repair. Barbara was 22, too old to be called girl by anyone who meant her well, too plain to be courted for beauty, too useful to be allowed rest. Since her father's illness had turned from weakness to delirium last winter, she had been moved from her own chamber to a former nursery under the eaves for convenience, while Lady McCarthy took the larger rooms on the south side with their carved mantelpieces and proper locks. Barbara had copied estate accounts at midnight by candle stubs because the steward's clerk had been dismissed to economise. She had handed over her mother's garnet bracelet for temporary pledging, watched silver leave the sideboard 1 salver at a time, and learned that dignity could be stripped as methodically as wallpaper. What remained to her was not much to look at: a good hand, a memory for numbers, and a habit her father had taught when she was 9 and furious at blotting a page. Read every line before you sign your name. Every line, Babs, especially the ones men tell you are routine. The vicar's prayer thinned into the rain. Soil struck lid. The moment by which everyone measured propriety had come and gone. Barbara expected, at most, another hour of rituals before being sent upstairs to recover in private, while Lady McCarthy rearranged the house as if widowhood were a new position she had long auditioned to fill. She did not expect Lord Westhaven. He had stood apart through the service, tall and motionless, in a dark coat cut with military severity, his hat brim shadowing a face known across 2 counties for never yielding expression cheaply. Men called him glacial when they wished to imply pride, disciplined when they wished to flatter. He was an earl by inheritance, a veteran by service, and, according to drawing-room rumour, in possession of manners too exact to be warm. Barbara had met him twice in her father's library, once over tea and once over maps. He had spoken to her courteously, no more, and looked at her not as furniture but as if she existed. It had been enough to startle her then, and did so now when he moved. He stepped past Lady McCarthy before she could turn her polished condolence toward him. Mud streaked his boots. He halted in front of Barbara, bowed with formal precision, and took her right hand. The churchyard went very quiet in the way of crowded places. That scent impropriety. He bent and touched his mouth to her glove. Anyone watching could have named it sympathy, old-fashioned and brief, an earl honouring a dead man's daughter. But his fingers pressed once at the base of her thumb, firm and unmistakable, and something dry and folded slid into her palm. When he released her, his eyes lifted to hers for no longer than a breath, steel grey, unreadable. Then he turned to Lady McCarthy and offered condolences in a voice as level as slate. Barbara closed her hand around the scrap until the paper edge bit skin. She did not read it at the graveside. She stood through the rest of the condolences, through the procession back toward the church porch, through Lady McCarthy's narrowed glance and one of her cousin's speculative smiles. Only when she escaped into the vestry on the pretence of straightening her veil did she unfasten her glove with stiff fingers and unfold the note. 9 words in a severe, compact hand. Do not let her burn the study papers tonight. For a moment she only stared. She heard rain drumming on leaded panes, the muted rise and fall of voices in the nave, the scrape of a chair leg somewhere behind the wall. Then her heartbeat kicked hard enough to make the letters blur. Her father's study papers, ledgers, correspondence, drafts, memoranda. The documents she had been denied access to in the final week of his illness because the sight of business agitated him. Lady McCarthy had locked the room and kept the key. Barbara folded the note again and tucked it into the seam of her sleeve. When she stepped from the vestry, Lady McCarthy was waiting in the aisle, her face composed into that look of tender forbearance she wore when she meant to strike. "There you are," she said softly. "Do try not to disappear. People notice odd behaviour at funerals." Barbara dipped her head. "Yes, ma'am." They rode home in the second carriage because the first was reserved for principal mourners and strategic conversation. The roads were rutted, the windows fogged with damp breath, and no one spoke for 3 miles except little Lucy in the opposite corner, who asked once in a whisper whether Papa would be cold in the ground, and then pressed her mouth shut when her mother told her not to be morbid. At the gates of McCarthy Hall, Lady McCarthy reached for Barbara's wrist before she could descend. "You will remain sensible this week," she said, without looking at her. "No tears in hallways, no scenes with servants, no dramatics. I have tolerated your sullenness out of respect for your father's weakness where you were concerned. That indulgence is ended." Barbara met her eyes. They were bright, dry, and hard as marbles. "I have made no scene, madam." "No? Then let us avoid one now. Mr. Edwin Crichton arrives Tuesday." The name meant nothing until Lady McCarthy supplied, with the slight smile of a person producing a favourable term sheet, "He owns mills in Lancashire and has been obliging enough to renew his offer. You will marry him within the week. It is for the good of the family accounts." The words did not seem to belong to weather carriage, mourning dress, or earth still fresh on her father's coffin. Barbara heard them as if from a distance. "Within the week? Do not imitate stupidity. You are 22 with no dowry worth naming, and a face that gives no one ideas. Mr. Crichton is as practical, solvent, and willing. In return he settles certain pressing obligations. You should be grateful." She released Barbara's wrist. "I am." Lucy made a tiny sound in the corner, half confusion and half fear. Barbara kept her voice even. "I will not agree without reading the settlement." Lady McCarthy laughed. "Very small, very sharp. You will sign what is put before you." "I read every line before I sign." "Your father's little lessons are no longer useful to you." But they were, useful as breath. Inside the hall, mourning cloaks were taken, boots changed, and trays appeared as if death required refreshment. Lady McCarthy glided toward the drawing-room to receive callers too persistent to leave at the church. Barbara took the back corridor, meaning for her father's study before anyone thought to watch that door. The corridor smelled of damp wool and beeswax. At the turn by the breakfast room, she stopped. 2 footmen and a kitchen maid were carrying armfuls of bound ledgers, loose bundles tied with string, and rolled maps from the direction of the study toward the rear passage that led to the kitchens. One ledger hung open as they moved. She recognised her father's square hand at a glance. "Where are you taking those?" she said. The elder footman avoided her eyes. "Mistress's orders, miss." "To where?" He hesitated. The maid answered in a whisper, "Kitchen hearth." For one stunned beat, Barbara did not move. Then she stepped directly into their path. "Put them down." "Miss, now!" They shifted, uncertain and frightened of choosing the wrong authority. Barbara reached for the open ledger, but before her fingers closed, Lady McCarthy's voice snapped down the corridor like a whip. "Barbara, stand aside." She turned. Lady McCarthy had appeared at the passage end, fan open in one hand, though there was no heat to warrant it, widow's veil pushed back from a face that had dropped all pretence of softness. "Those papers are our household clutter," Lady McCarthy said. "Outdated, redundant, and of no concern to you." "They are estate records." "They are tinder. Move." Barbara heard again the 9 words in her sleeve. "Do not let her burn the study papers tonight." "No," she said. The fan struck before she fully registered motion. Ivory ribs cracked against her cheekbone with a sharp, humiliating sting. The servants froze. Lady McCarthy's voice rose so the house might witness filial ingratitude. "You ungrateful creature, fed, clothed, maintained for years from my husband's charity. And this is how you repay me, by challenging me in my own hall." The words were for the staff as much as for Barbara, a story set in place before facts could interfere. Barbara tasted blood where her teeth had caught lip. She kept her hands at her sides. "Those books belong to the estate, and until probate—" "Enough!" Lady McCarthy closed the fan with a crack. "Take her upstairs. She will remain in her room until she has learned obedience. Mrs. Talbot, lock the schoolroom stair as well. No one is to admit her anywhere without my permission." Mrs. Talbot, who had nursed Barbara through scarlet fever at 10, and now wore terror in every line of her face, approached with keys shaking against her apron. "Miss Barbara, if you please." At the stair-foot, Barbara looked back once. The footman stood burdened and miserable, waiting for orders. Lady McCarthy gave them a brisk nod toward the rear passage. Papers shifted in their arms like wounded birds. Upstairs, the former nursery was exactly as she had left it. Narrow bed, washstand, 1 trunk, 1 chair, cracked paint in the corner where rain found the wall. She stood in the centre while Mrs. Talbot hovered in the doorway. "I'm sorry, miss," the older woman whispered. "She says if anyone disobeys, wages stop." "I know." Barbara sat and unlaced her soaked boots with careful fingers. "Did she say when Mr. Crichton comes?" "Tuesday supper, with his solicitor, they say." "And the papers from the study?" Mrs. Talbot swallowed. "Cook has the great hearth lit." The key turned in the lock. Barbara waited until the footsteps faded. Then she crossed to the window and lifted the sash an inch for air. Rain blew cold against her face. Below, in the courtyard, smoke already thickened from the kitchen chimney, darker than ordinary cooking fire. Within a week, she could be married to a man she had never met, sent north, stripped of name and property alike, while the only records that might explain the estate's sudden debts burned to ash before evening tea. If she submitted, Lucy would grow under Lady McCarthy's hand, with no one in the house obliged to tell her truth from performance. If she rebelled without proof, she would be called hysterical, dutifully removed, and signed away with blessing from every man who preferred a quiet ledger to a scandal. Barbara pressed her burned palm against the sill until the pain sharpened her thinking. Read every line, keep every figure. Do not let her burn the study papers tonight. Downstairs a door slammed. Voices rose. Somewhere in the yard a boy cried out, thin and startled, then was abruptly hushed. Barbara turned toward the locked door, already counting distances in her head. From nursery to schoolroom passage, from passage to back stair, from back stair to the pump yard and kitchens where smoke thickened under the rain. She crossed the nursery in 3 strides and tested the door anyway, though she had heard the key turn. Locked. The adjoining closet still stood open. Beyond it, a narrow communicating door led to the old schoolroom where she had once conjugated Latin verbs under Miss Prentice's ruler and now stored trunks no one wanted in better rooms. Lady McCarthy had ordered the schoolroom stair locked, but orders took minutes to become iron. Barbara dragged her trunk beneath the communicating door, climbed and drove a hat pin into the old latch. The metal slipped once, twice, then caught. She twisted. The latch clicked back with a small, treacherous sound that might have been heard in the passage if anyone had been listening. No one was listening. Another cry rose from the yard below, higher this time, ragged with pain. She squeezed through into the schoolroom, skirts snagging on a splintered panel, and ran for the stair. At the top landing she found Mrs. Talbot's precautions half complete, chain and padlock hanging from the newel post, not yet fastened through the eye-bolt at the wall. Someone had been interrupted. Barbara thanked whatever saints looked after unfinished cruelty, gathered her skirts, and went down 3 steps at a time. Heat hit before she reached the back corridor. Not flame. The kitchens were stone and brick, but the dense, over-fired warmth of a hearth fed too hard. Smoke stung the air. In the flagged pump yard, 2 scullery maids stood wringing their hands beside the pump handle, staring at a heap of stable jacket collapsed near the trough. "Move," Barbara said, and dropped to her knees. It was Ned Pike, one of the younger stable hands, 19 last Michaelmas, freckled and all elbows in ordinary life. Now his right sleeve was soaked and clinging, skin beneath angry red where boiling water had splashed from shoulder to wrist. His face had gone grey under soot, lashes stuck together, breath coming in quick panicked snatches that ended in a whimper each time he shifted. "He slipped with the copper kettle," one maid babbled. "Cook said leave him till she finished with—" "Finished with what?" The maid's gaze flew toward the kitchen door and away. Barbara did not waste breath on fury. "Annie, work the pump gently. Mary, tear linen strips from that basket and find clean grease, goose, mutton, I do not care. Then run for Mr. Jenks. Run!" Mary hesitated, eyes huge. "Her ladyship said nobody's to leave." Barbara seized the girl's wrist, not hard, only enough to force attention. "If he loses his arm because you obeyed a stupid order, will her ladyship sit with him nights when the fever starts? Go!" Something in her tone cut through fear. Mary bolted. Cold water arced from the pump and splashed over Ned's burn. He screamed once, then sucked air through his teeth and clamped his jaw. Barbara held his uninjured shoulder and counted under her breath to steady him. 10, 20, 30. The skin looked worse as the heat came out, but he was breathing less wildly. "There," she said. "You're doing very well. Look at me, Ned." His eyes fluttered open. "Miss Barbara?" "Yes." He swallowed with visible effort. Didn't mean to spill. She told me carry from copper. Quick, no dawdling." "Who told you?" He blinked as if the answer might be dangerous on his tongue. "Mrs. Bletchley, for the kitchen fire. Said must be blazing straight off." For paper, Barbara thought. For ledgers and maps and her father's hand reduced to ash. She kept her voice even. "Did you see what they were burning?" "Books, big ones, and bundles." His lower lip shook. "I tried not look. She said if I gaped I'd get box on ear. Annie pumped in silence, tears on her cheeks from smoke and fright. Barbara wrapped wet linen around Ned's arm as best she could and tied it with strips torn from her own petticoat hem. From the passage came brisk footsteps and Lady McCarthy's voice before her figure appeared. "What is this theatrics in my yard?" She stopped short at the sight of Barbara kneeling in mud and water, bareheaded now, sleeves soaked to the elbow, her eyes narrowed. "I gave explicit instructions," she said. Barbara rose slowly. "Ned has been scalded. Mr. Jenks is sent for." "You countermanded me." "I prevented a permanent injury." Lady McCarthy's mouth thinned. "You prevented discipline. Servants who panic at kitchen mishaps are replaceable. Servants who run to market with household tales are expensive." Ned made a strangled sound. Barbara took one step, so she stood between him and Lady McCarthy's line of sight. "Then dock my allowance," she said, though she had no allowance to dock, not his skin. For one suspended second, Barbara thought Lady McCarthy might strike her again, before all the kitchen stuff. Instead, the older woman smiled, a colder expression than anger. "Very touching. Since you are determined to play nursemaid, you may do so under watch. Mrs. Talbot will remain with you, and if you set foot in my husband's study or any office or any room where documents are kept, I shall have your trunk sent to Mr. Crichton before Tuesday and let him train obedience out of you." She turned on her heel. "Bletchley, stoke the fire. Everything from the third stack goes in tonight." The kitchen door banged behind her. Barbara stood motionless until the sound settled. Then she knelt again, helped Ned drink water in sips, and waited for the surgeon. "Mr." Jenks came with his bag and vinegar breath, and did not ask permission of anyone when he took over, which Barbara silently blessed. Burns were dressed, laudanum measured by drops, fever warnings issued. Ned was moved to the tack room, where it stayed cooler than the servants' attic. Barbara sat on an overturned bucket, while Jenks wrapped final bandages and listened to his grumble about idiots and boiling kettles. When he had gone and twilight deepened, Mrs. Talbot appeared at the tack room door with a lantern and a face pinched by divided loyalties. "Miss, you must come up. She asked for you twice." "In a moment." Mrs. Talbot lowered her voice. "Please do not make me drag you by force. I could not bear it." Barbara touched her hand once. "You won't have to." When the older woman withdrew, Ned turned his head on the folded horse blanket serving as pillow. Pain had made him look younger. His freckles stood out like ink spatter. "Miss." "Yes." He swallowed. "Don't let her send me off." Barbara leaned closer. "No one is sending you anywhere while I have breath to object." He stared at the rafters. "I done things, though." Something in his tone tightened the air. "What things?" His left hand fisted in the blanket. "Carried packets. For months. After midnight, when Grooms was abed. Mrs. Bletchley would give me wrapped papers and coin, heavy like sovereign rolls. Say ride to town, to Mr. Lascelles' office door. Knock 3 times. Leave it with his clerk, if he weren't there." "The family solicitor?" Barbara kept her expression still, though her pulse kicked. "Did you ever see what was in the papers?" "Seals, miss. Red ones. Sometimes her ladyship's ring mark, sometimes no mark. Once she sent me back for one package what had wrong initials." "Whose initials?" He squinted with effort. "J.M.C., I think." "Not B, not Yawn." "James McCarthy." "Her father." Ned wet his cracked lips. "Last week she asked if I'd ever seen a blue atlas in Master's study. Said if I found it I'd get half a crown. I said no. She slapped me and said keep shut if I wanted a place." Barbara heard, very distinctly, the rain on roof slates and a far thud from the kitchens where wood was still being fed to flame. Blue atlas. There were 3 atlases in her father's study, 1 brown morocco, 1 calf bound with brass corners, and 1 blue cloth volume with a torn spine repaired in black tape. He had kept it on the lower left shelf because the upper shelf was too high for Lucy. Ned caught at her sleeve. "Don't say I told. She'll have me enrobed." "I won't say," Barbara said, "but you may need to tell it where it matters, later. To men in wigs with ink on their fingers." His eyes widened in terror. "Not tonight," she added. "Tonight you sleep." A rap sounded on the half-open tack-room door. Not Lady McCarthy's impatient knock, nor Talbot's timid tap. 3 measured strikes, pause, 1 strike. A pattern. A stable hand Barbara barely knew leaned in. "Message for Miss McCarthy. Man on a grey horse left it at the side gate. Said only your hand." He held out a folded square sealed with plain wax. Barbara took it and waited until he had gone. The seal bore no crest, only the clean knife line of someone who did not advertise. Inside, in the same severe hand as at the funeral, blue atlas, Iberia map section, key taped under spine. No signature, no wasted word. Ned watched her face and went pale. "It's true, then." Barbara folded the note into her cuff beside the first. "It may be. Who sent?" "A man who dislikes waste," she said, and stood. "Can you keep awake 10 minutes if I ask it?" He gave a small, miserable nod. "Good. If anyone asks where I am, say I'm in the still room finding lint. Say it confidently. Liars are believed when they sound bored." To Mrs. Talbot, waiting in the passage with lantern lifted like a warning star, Barbara said, "Ned is sleeping. I must fetch more linen from the still-room shelves." "I can fetch. It is sorted wrong in those cupboards. I know where." She pitched her voice to weary practicality. Talbot had always been vulnerable to competence. "Please tell cook, Mr. Jenks, forbade further heat near him." Talbot bit her lip. 2 minutes. 3. Barbara took the lantern and turned not toward the still-room, but toward the narrow service corridor that opened, if one knew where to press, onto the study passage. The study door was locked. Of course! Lady McCarthy had worn the key on her chatelaine all day like a medal. But locks in old houses grew vain with age. The panel to the left of the jamb had warped each winter since Barbara was 16. She set the lantern down, slipped a kitchen knife from her pocket, borrowed from the tack-room tray, and worked the blade against the loosened moulding until the thin strip sprang free. Behind it, the latch mechanism sat exposed enough for a patient hand. Her fingers shook once, then steadied. Inside, the room smelled of leather, extinguished fire, and her father's pipe tobacco, gone stale in the curtain folds. Moonlight and lantern light made islands across the desk. Shelves yawned where ledgers had been stripped for burning. Gaps looked like missing teeth. Blue atlas, lower left shelf. She pulled it free, heavier than it should be. The repaired spine showed the strip of black tape she remembered, but under her thumb she felt another thickness, a concealed ridge. She peeled back the tape edge with her nail. A small brass key dropped into her palm. No breath, no thought, only movement. The dispatch box sat where it had always sat, under the escritoire's side table among old parliamentary reports no one read. Mahogany, iron-banded, lock untouched. Her father had told everyone it held obsolete military correspondence from his uncle. She had never seen it open. The key turned with a resistant scrape. Inside lay 2 ledger books wrapped in oilcloth, a packet of receipts tied with blue ribbon, and a folded document sealed with her father's signet wax. broken and resealed clumsily as if opened by hands less practised than his. Beneath all that, tucked in the false bottom she found by tapping, was a slim notebook in his hand. Dates, dosages, names. She sat in his chair because her knees would not hold her otherwise and opened the first ledger. Duplicate estate accounts, same months as the official books she had copied. But these columns balanced cleanly where the household versions had bled red. Rents marked received here had been marked in arrears there. Tenant remissions invented in one book vanished in the other. Money moved like water through channels someone had dug in darkness. She opened the folded document. Codicil to will, dated during the week when her father had been too drugged to hold a spoon steady. Signature resembling his at distance, wrong at close view. The second stroke of the M too long, the pressure uneven. Witness names she did not recognise. Clauses transferring management to Lady McCarthy pending Lucy's majority. Provision of a marriage portion for Barbara, payable only upon union approved by Lady McCarthy and solicitor. A legal noose dressed as care. In the notebook beneath, her father's hand had become jagged near the end, but remained his unmistakably. February 10th. Draft increased again, against my request. Somnolence unnatural. February 13th. Asked for Westhaven. Told he had not called. I do not believe this. February 17th. If confusion worsens, B must not sign anything unwitnessed. B, her. Barbara pressed fingertips to her eyes until sparks danced. Grief, fury, vindication, all useless if she misstepped. Lady McCarthy would call theft. Lascelles would call forgery. Men of rank would call it regrettable family disturbance and ask her to let wiser heads settle matters privately. Private had nearly burned tonight. A clock chimed quarter hours somewhere distant. She repacked the box, slipped the notebook into her bodice, and doused the lantern before she left so no one could chart her route by moving light. By the time she returned to the tack-room passage, Mrs. Talbot was wringing her apron. 3 minutes, you said. I was delayed by incompetence, Barbara said, and hated herself a little for lying to the one person who had been kind. Ned needed fresh water. Talbot peered at her face. You've gone white. So have we all. She went upstairs under escort and this time did not test the locked door. She sat on her bed, fully dressed, dispatch box beneath her skirts, and waited through the longest night she had ever measured. At 5, the house was at its thinnest, kitchen fires not yet rebuilt, maids yawning over pails, Lady McCarthy still abed after a late conference with Mr. Lascelles in the drawing-room that had gone on past midnight. Barbara had heard their low voices through floorboards like the hum of wasps. She tied on a plain cloak, wrapped the dispatch box in sacking, and carried it down the back stair as if it were laundry. Ned slept under laudanum. Mrs. Talbot snored in a chair outside the nursery door, key still in her lap. Barbara tucked a blanket around the older woman's shoulders and slipped past. The east sky showed iron grey when she crossed the paddock to the post road. Westhaven Abbey lay 3 miles away if one cut through the copse, and did not mind wet boots. She minded nothing. By the time she reached the Abbey's side entrance, her hem was muddy to the knee and her hands numb. A porter blinked at her as if ghosts now called at dawn. She gave her name. Something in her expression or tone must have convinced him this was not a social visit. He bowed and led her not to a salon, but to a smaller morning room with maps on the wall and a fire laid but unlit. Lord Westhaven entered within minutes, already dressed for riding. No surprise crossed his face at seeing her with a sacking-wrapped box on his table. "Miss McCarthy," he said, "you came." It was absurdly close to kindness. "I did," Barbara said, because your note said not to let her burn papers. She tried. I stopped what I could. Her throat tightened. She forced it steady. If this is some county game, my lord, I am done being moved as a piece. It is not a game. Then explain. He dismissed the porter with a glance and closed the door himself. Then he untied the sacking, set the dispatch box square in morning light, and looked at her with the same exact attention he had used in her father's library over maps. Your father sent for me in February, he said, twice. Both messages were delayed. I reached him on the 19th when he had 2 lucid hours. He believed funds were being diverted from the estate and that he would not survive to audit it. He wrote a private memorandum naming me executor of his personal instructions pending formal probate. It is not, by itself, a will. It is enough to compel review if supported by records. Barbara felt anger rise, sharp and cold. You had this for weeks. I had suspicion, he corrected, not proof admissible in court. If I accused your stepmother without it, Lascelles would have cried aristocratic interference and had every paper quietly regularised before I could blink. You and Lucy would still be in her house, only watched more closely. You might have warned me. I am warning you now. He touched the ledger edge. When I kissed your hand yesterday, it served 2 purposes. The note was for you. The gesture was for her. Barbara stared. For her? To tell Lady McCarthy someone outside her control was paying attention. Predators grow clumsy when they think they have witnesses. The blunt word, predators, hit harder than euphemism would have. She remembered Lady McCarthy's smile in the yard. I shall have your trunk sent to Mr. Crichton before Tuesday. Westhaven opened the first ledger, skimmed 3 pages, then turned to the codicil and went still. This is crude work, he said softly. Crude enough to hang a solicitor if tied correctly. Mr. Lascelles, Barbara said. Ned Pike delivered coin packets to his office after midnight for months. Westhaven's gaze snapped to her. Can Ned testify? He is 19 and terrified. Terrified witnesses can still be believed if corroborated. He laid out the documents in order. Duplicate books, receipts, codicil, notebook. Methodical, unemotional. Yet his jaw tightened once at the laudanum entries. Here are your options, he said. First, I take this to my man in York, file injunction, and remove you to my aunt's protection immediately. Safe, but slow. Lascelles will attempt delay, question chain of custody, and paint you as hysterical. Second, we allow the scheduled codicil reading to proceed in 2 days. You appear with originals and witnesses, challenge in open room before magistrate, clergy, and interested parties. Dangerous, faster, difficult to bury. Barbara had come expecting him to choose for her to issue instructions in that glacial voice and put law between her and the house. Instead, he set choices on the table like loaded pistols and waited. In the pause, she heard again Lady McCarthy at the carriage. You will sign what is put before you, heard herself answer. I read every line. Heard, too, the old shame she had carried for years, that she was useful, plain, kept. A girl insisted upon. If Westhaven fought everything for her behind closed doors, she might be saved and still remain, in every eye that mattered, a dependent rescued by a man of rank. Lady McCarthy's story would simply receive better tailoring. Barbara lifted her chin. The reading. In public. Westhaven did not nod approval like a tutor rewarding a pupil. He only said, Then we prepare thoroughly. No grand speeches, no righteous thunder, dates, figures, signatures. You speak facts and let them choke on them. A breath she had not known she held left her. I can do figures. I know. For the first time, the steel in his face eased by a degree. Your father knew as well. He wrote in that memorandum that of all his children you had the steadiest head for accounts and the least taste for applause. Heat rose unexpectedly behind Barbara's eyes. She blinked it back. What else did he write? That if you were ever told to sign in haste, I was to remind you of your own rule. Westhaven's mouth almost formed a smile. Read every line. She gave a short, incredulous breath that might have been laugh if the room had been different and her clothes less wet. He never believed anyone listened to him, except Ledgers. He listened to you. Outside, the first full bell of morning sounded from the Abbey chapel. Westhaven gathered the papers into neat bundles and pushed them toward her, not taking possession. These remain yours. I will have certified copies made within the hour by a clerk, I trust. You return before the household is fully awake. Behave as if nothing has altered, and keep the originals hidden where fire cannot reach quickly. And Mr. Crichton, let him arrive. The more witnesses in York, the better. Barbara stood, fingers closing on the packet. If Lady McCarthy tries to force my signature before then, sign nothing. If physically coerced, make any mark but your name and speak the coercion in front of 2 servants. It muddies enforceability. She nodded once. Practical, unromantic, exactly what she needed. At the door she paused. My lord, why help us at all? My father was a neighbour, not kin. Westhaven's answer was immediate. Because theft under a sick man's roof is cowardice. Because your father asked. Because you looked at an open grave yesterday and did not lower your eyes. Barbara held his gaze. The detachment she had once read as indifference now looked different. Not emptiness, but control deliberately chosen in a world where men like Lascelles fed on spectacle and weak points. Very well, she said. In York, then. In York. She stepped out into morning with mud on her hem, ink-stained evidence under her cloak, and a plan that required no rescue, only nerve, arithmetic, and the willingness to speak where silence had been expected. She stepped out into morning with mud on her hem, ink-stained evidence under her cloak, and a plan that required no rescue, only nerve, arithmetic, and the willingness to speak where silence had been expected. By the time McCarthy Hall came into view through the wet trees, the house was too awake for that hour. Kitchen smoke already streamed from both chimneys. A groom she did not know held the front bays, while a travelling chaise stood in the sweep, lacquer still beaded with road rain. In the lower drawing-room windows, candles burned despite daylight. Visitors, then, and not condolence callers. Barbara cut toward the side door, hoping to reach the nursery passage before anyone marked her return. She had one hand on the latch when Jenkins, the butler, appeared from nowhere with the expression of a man walking a beam over floodwater. "Miss Barbara," he said, voice low and tight, "her ladyship requests you at breakfast, at once." "Who has come?" "Mr. Crichton, miss, and Mr. Lascelles." A day early. Her fingers tightened on the wrapped packet beneath her cloak. Of course. In the breakfast room, Lady McCarthy sat at the head of the table, in dove-grey morning silk, not black, as though widowhood had already begun to soften around the edges. At her right lounged a broad man with a side whiskers and a satin waistcoat straining at the buttons. Mr. Edwin Crichton, practical and solvent and willing. At her left, neat as folded paper, sat Mr. Lascelles with his solicitor's hands resting on a leather dispatch case. All 3 looked up together when Barbara entered. Lady McCarthy smiled. "There she is, our wanderer." Crichton's gaze ran over Barbara's damp cloak, paused at the mud line on her skirt, and sharpened with proprietary annoyance. "Out before breakfast, miss. Bold." Barbara ignored him and addressed Lady McCarthy. "You sent for me?" "I did. Sit." I prefer to stand. Lady McCarthy's smile thinned but did not break. As you wish. Mr. Crichton was eager to advance matters. In this unsettled period, expedience is kindness. Your settlement will be signed this morning, and we leave for York this evening rather than tomorrow. Lascelles opened the dispatch case and withdrew a folded sheaf. Routine instruments, he said, merely acknowledgement and consent. Barbara held out her hand. I will read. Crichton gave a short laugh. Hear that? She can read. Barbara met his eyes, and for the first time he seemed to understand she was not simple prey. Lascelles passed her the document. She read standing, hearing the soft scrape of toast knives and cups, while the room waited for her to be ashamed of taking time. Consent to marriage settlement, yes. Transfer of certain funds, yes. Then, halfway down the second page, language tucked beneath legal padding. In the event of Miss Barbara McCarthy's refusal to contract marriage, according to family arrangement, temporary care and instruction of Miss Lucy Ann McCarthy shall be vested exclusively in Lady Eleanor McCarthy, without challenge from the undersigned. Barbara read it twice, then lowered the papers. This is not routine. Lady McCarthy dabbed her mouth with linen. It is prudence. Lucy is 9. She requires stability, not your theatrical notions of guardianship. Barbara set the pages on the table. I will not sign. Crichton sat forward, colour rising. Madam, I did not ride through rain to be trifled with by a... Lady McCarthy lifted one finger. He subsided, muttering. She turned to Barbara with a tone almost gentle. My dear, perhaps we should speak plainly. While you were absent from your room at dawn, the house was searched for estate property removed without authorization. Her eyes dipped to Barbara's cloak. Hand me what you are carrying. The room went still enough to hear rain tapping glass. Barbara did not move. Lascelles stood. Miss McCarthy, if documents have been taken from your late father's locked study, retaining them may constitute theft. From my father's study, Barbara said. In my father's house. In law, he said smoothly. Possession and authority are not identical. Lady McCarthy's voice sharpened. Do not force a scene. Barbara had no leverage in that room, not yet. Jenkins stood at the sideboard, white-faced and rigid. 2 footmen waited outside the half-open door. Crichton looked eager for roughness. If she resisted physically, they would call it hysteria and strip her anyway. She untied her cloak. The oilcloth packet and the small wrapped ledger parcel dropped with a dull weight onto the table between the coffee service and the marmalade. Crichton whistled. Well now. Lascelles was already unwrapping. Eyes bright with triumph, he tried to hide behind professionalism. Ledger, receipts, codicil. He touched the wax seal and gave a tiny, satisfied breath. Lady McCarthy did not look at the papers. She looked only at Barbara. Thank you, she said. You see, cooperation can be learned. Something hot and reckless surged through Barbara's chest, then cooled into iron. Westhaven had copies. Westhaven had seen everything. But these originals were no small matter. In a room of magistrates, originals shouted where copies merely argued. Lascelles repacked the documents into his own case and snapped it shut. For safe keeping until formal reading, Barbara said very quietly. If one page in that case is altered again, I will name you before the county. He smiled without humour. You overestimate your footing, miss. Perhaps, she said. I have spent years in mud. I know where footing gives. Lady McCarthy rose. Enough. You will dress for travel and present yourself at 4. If you decline, Lucy will depart this afternoon for Lancashire under Mr. Crichton's household, where she will be raised properly and taught not to imitate your ingratitude. Barbara's breath caught despite herself. You would send her away now? She leaves if I say she leaves. Lucy was not in the schoolroom when Barbara went there. Her slate still lay on the desk, chalk half finished, at a multiplication table Barbara had set her 2 days before. Her little knitted rabbit sat on the window-sill, one ear hanging by a thread. Mrs. Talbot was gone too. Jenkins, cornered near the linen press, whispered that she had been dismissed for negligence and put in a carrier cart at 10, with no character reference and half wages withheld. Ned had been moved from the tack room before dawn by 2 men from town, with a note bearing Lascelles' seal. County infirmary transfer. Fever risk. No one knew which infirmary. By noon, Barbara had lost her best witness, and the only woman in the house who might have defied a locked door. She made one attempt to reach the village. At the rear gate she found it chained, not for weather, but with fresh iron and a new lock. 2 hired men in dark coats stood beneath the yew hedge, pretending not to watch her. One touched his hat without warmth when she approached. "Orders, miss. No one out by this way." "Since when?" "Since this morning." "And if I walk through my own lower meadow?" He glanced toward the house. "Then we are to bring you back." Barbara turned away before she gave them the satisfaction of argument. On the path beside the dairy wall she pressed a hand against damp stone and fought, for one wild minute, the urge to sit down in the mud and let the day crush her. Westhaven had copies. Westhaven had the memorandum. Facts had not vanished, only moved beyond her reach, yet each practical consolation dissolved against the immediate losses. Lucy, hidden somewhere in the house, perhaps already packed for strangers. Ned, drugged and frightened, carried off where she could not prepare him. Mrs. Talbot sacrificed for opening nothing but a chain too slowly. Her plan had been built on timing, arrive in York with originals, with witnesses, with composure. Lady McCarthy had struck all 3 before luncheon. At 1, a maid brought her a tray and a folded note with no salutation. "You may see Lucy for 10 minutes if you sign the enclosed acknowledgement immediately." The acknowledgement was a single page this time. Plain language. "I, Barbara McCarthy, affirm that documents removed from my late father's study were taken by me without permission and delivered voluntarily this day to Mr. Lascelles for proper legal handling. A confession disguised as clerical tidiness." She stared at it until the letters blurred. If she refused, Lucy might be moved out of the house without farewell. If she signed, Lascelles would wave it in York as proof she had stolen and meddled. She tore the page in half. No one brought Lucy. At 3, Lady McCarthy sent the paper again, recopied, with a new line inserted. "Upon signature, Miss Lucy Ann McCarthy remains at McCarthy Hall until after probate hearing." Barbara read every word. Remains at Hall, not safe, not with me, but not in a carriage to Lancashire tonight. She signed her name with a hand that felt detached from her body. When she delivered it herself to Lady McCarthy's sitting room, her stepmother took the page, glanced at the signature, and rang for a maid without thanking her. "Take this to Mr. Lascelles," Barbara said. "I signed for Lucy to remain." Lady McCarthy did not look up from her embroidery. "And so she shall, for now. For now is not what the paper states." At that, Lady McCarthy lifted her head, eyes bright with cruel amusement. "My dear Barbara, men who draft papers also interpret them. You should have married 1 year ago." Lucy was still not produced. The loss landed then. Not abstract, not strategic, but physical. Barbara had traded clean ground for quicksand and received nothing immediate in return. She went back to the nursery, shut the door, and sat on the narrow bed staring at her ink-stained fingers until dusk climbed the wall. At Westhaven Abbey, Oliver Harrowby, Earl of Westhaven, stood at his study window and watched rain stripe the glass like musket fire. On the desk behind him lay the certified copies, sanded and stacked, each page signed by Wainwright the clerk and countersigned by the vicar from Little Bram as witness to authenticity, done properly, done quickly, done exactly as procedure demanded. At noon his groom had ridden back from McCarthy Hall with news. Barbara intercepted, papers seized by Lascelles, house gates chained, hired men posted. Westhaven had thanked the groom, dismissed him, and closed the study door before he put his fist through a dispatch basket. His valet found him minutes later binding his own knuckles with linen strips while pretending to review statutes. "Shall I send for the surgeon, my lord?" "No. It will swell." "Let it." Rooke, who had served him through Portugal and knew the sounds of anger held too long, said carefully, "You cannot storm that house." Westhaven gave a short, bitter breath. "No, I can only outpaper a thief before he destroys a woman's life." He sat, then rose again. Stillness failed him. In campaign years he had learned to make calm a weapon. Now calm felt like cowardice, wearing polished boots. He had failed once already. James McCarthy's first summons in February had been delayed at the Abbey Lodge by a drunken undergardener and reached Westhaven 3 days late. 3 days in which laudanum doses rose and signatures were taken. He had told himself then that precision would repair delay. Collect proof, build chain, avoid noise until one could strike decisively. Decisively had looked this morning like Barbara carrying evidence through rain alone because his caution had left her in the same house as her enemy. There were memories he kept under lock tighter than any dispatch box. A farmhouse outside Badajoz, a civilian family waving white cloth, his lieutenant urging immediate entry, Westhaven insisting on flanking first because haste got men killed. By the time they reached the rear door, French stragglers had fired from the loft. 2 children dead, lieutenant bleeding out in straw. Discipline had saved 6 soldiers and cost 3 villagers. He had never found arithmetic for that. A knock. His aunt, Lady Agnes, entered without waiting for answer, as she had since he was 12 and newly orphaned. "You are wearing a path in the carpet, Oliver." He did not turn. Lascelles moved faster than expected. "I know. Your messenger told me." She crossed to the desk, read the top copy without touching it. "Miss McCarthy?" "Contained." A pause. Then, quietly, "You care whether she is hurt?" He closed his eyes once. "Yes!" "Then stop speaking of her as a problem set." He looked at her. Lady Agnes had buried a husband, 2 infants, and 1 son at sea. She had no patience for men who mistook restraint for virtue in all circumstances. "If I ride there and remove her by force of title," he said, "Lascelles paints her compromised, me predatory, and every magistrate in York closes ranks against scandal. She loses before we begin." "And if you do nothing?" "I have not done nothing." He tapped the copied memorandum. "I have sworn statement ready. I have requisition for Magistrate Hale to attend the reading. I have subpoena drafts for the apothecary's apprentice and for Ned Pike if he can be found." "If," Lady Agnes softened just a little. "You are afraid, then," he answered before pride could interfere. "Yes." "Of losing the case? Of being too late again?" The silence that followed was not gentle, but it was honest. At last, Lady Agnes squeezed his uninjured hand once and left him to his papers. Westhaven sat, drew a fresh sheet, and wrote in his own hand to Magistrate Hale. Formal request, legal grounds, appended memorandum. Then another note, shorter, unsealed, to Barbara, routed through the only servant at Hall he trusted to risk delivery. "If they isolate you, speak less and observe more. I am moving tonight for compulsory attendance orders and sworn safeguards for the witnesses. Hold until York. He sealed it with plain wax because crests invited interception. At 4, the house shifted into travel mode with unnatural efficiency. Trunks appeared in the front hall. Crichton barked at coachman as if already master. Lascelles moved room to room, collecting papers, and people with the tidy ruthlessness of a man balancing a hostile ledger. Lady McCarthy, composed and almost cheerful, gave orders for Lucy's nursemaid to remain behind until further notice, then countermanded herself and had the child's small valise brought down after all. Barbara saw it from the stair landing. Lucy's blue valise with the cracked strap. She descended before she knew she had decided. "Where is my sister going?" Lady McCarthy did not even turn. "To York, naturally. A family proceeding concerns the family." Crichton chuckled. "Girl'll learn business." Lucy was produced at last from the morning room, pale and over-buttoned, her hand clamped in a maid's grip. She saw Barbara and tried to run to her. The maid held fast. "Barbara, are we going away? Mamma says I mustn't talk to anyone in York unless she nods first." Barbara crouched so their eyes met. "Listen to me, Lou. Stay near me when you can. If we are separated, you tell the first clergyman you see that you wish to speak with Mr. Hale. Can you remember?" "Mr. Hale," Lucy whispered. "Hale!" Lady McCarthy's voice cut in. "Do stop filling her head with melodrama." As if on cue, Jenkins entered with a silver tray and one folded slip. "For Miss Barbara, delivered by stable boy, no name." Barbara opened it with her thumb shielding the hand. "Pike located, apprentice secured. Do not drink anything not poured by yourself. W." She folded it into her glove before Lady McCarthy could ask. At 6 they set out in 2 carriages, under a sky gone low and yellow with coming storm. Lady McCarthy, Lucy and Crichton took the first with Lascelles opposite them. Barbara was directed to the second with Mrs. Bletchley, and one hired guard on the box. The inside handle had been removed. She discovered that only after the door shut. "Temporary repair," Bletchley said blandly, seeing her test it. They rolled through the gate, wheels hissing on wet gravel. For the first mile, Barbara counted turns by habit. East, past the chapel ruin, north at the ash copse, then the long rise toward the York Road. At the ash copse, the lead carriage turned north as expected. At the crossroads beyond Mill Lane, Barbara's carriage did not follow. Instead, their driver snapped reins left, west, onto the old turnpike that led, by night and bad roads, toward the Lancashire route. Barbara lunged forward. "Stop this carriage!" Bletchley did not meet her eyes. "Orders are orders, miss." "From whom?" No answer. She hammered the panel with her fist. "Driver, you are on the wrong road." The guard on the box shouted something she could not catch over the wind. The horses did not slow. Through the rear glass she saw, far behind now, no sign of the first carriage at all, only rain beginning again in silver sheets, swallowing tracks as quickly as wheels made them. York lay to the north with her witnesses, the magistrate, and the only room where truth might survive rank. She was being taken west in a locked box with a housekeeper who had helped burn ledgers. Barbara sat very still, one hand closing around the hatpin hidden in her sleeve, and began counting the bolts between the door hinges. Barbara sat very still, one hand closing around the hatpin hidden in her sleeve, and began counting the bolts between the door hinges. 1 at the top plate, 2 at centre, 2 at the lower strap. Old iron, square heads, rust at the edges where rain had found the seam. Not removable with a pin. The window latch, then. She shifted as if to steady herself against a rut and let her shoulder knock Bletchley's. "I am going to be sick," she said, and pitched her voice low and urgent. "If you wish to arrive with your skirts clean, open that window." Bletchley recoiled. "Keep your corner." Barbara pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and made a dry, choking sound that was not entirely false. The carriage lurched over a stone. She bent double and shoved her bonnet hard against the opposite seat, as if retching into it. "Good God!" Bletchley hissed and reached instinctively toward the window strap. Barbara moved. The hatpin drove into the older woman's wrist, not deep, just enough to shock. Bletchley cried out and snatched back her hand. In the same motion, Barbara ripped the loosened strap, slammed her palm against the pane until it cracked, then struck again with the brass edge of her reticule clasp. Glass burst outward in a spray of rain and wind. She thrust her head through the jagged opening and screamed with everything in her chest. "Help! Unlawful carriage! I am Barbara McCarthy, taken from York, probate!" The guard on the box swore. Reins jerked. The horses plunged, then slowed as the road narrowed toward a toll bar, where 2 wagons already waited under dripping elm branches. Men turned. A woman with a basket dropped it in the mud. The tollkeeper stepped from his hut, lantern raised, though it was not yet dark. "Drive on!" the guard shouted. Barbara seized the inside leather strap, braced both feet, and kicked the fractured window frame outward with her heel until half the sash hung loose. Rain slapped her face. "Stop this carriage!" she shouted to the road. "Witnesses, mark the crest!" The tollkeeper planted himself in front of the pole. "No coach passes while there's murder squalling inside," he yelled back. "It's family business," the guard snapped. "Lady McCarthy's orders." "Then Lady McCarthy can explain it to a magistrate." He did not move. The carriage rocked to a halt hard enough to throw Bletchley sideways. Barbara wrenched the interior latch plate with a hatpin wedged under the spring tongue. It held for one maddening second, then gave. The door flew open into rain. She jumped down, landed badly, and nearly went to her knees. Mud soaked her hem. Her ankle flared pain, but it held weight. The guard dropped from the box and reached for her arm. "Back in, miss!" Barbara stepped backward into full view of the queue and raised her voice clear and cold. "Touch me, and I will accuse you of assault before every man here. I am summoned to York for estate proceedings. These people have turned west without consent and removed the door handle. Ask the housekeeper if I lie." Bletchley had climbed out, clutching her wrist, face chalky with fury. "She's hysterical. Bereavement." Barbara turned to the tollkeeper. "Sir, write this in your log. McCarthy Crest carriage, second coach, diverted from York Road at Mill Lane. Witnesses present. Give your name." He stared, then straightened. "Tom Kersey." "Thank you, Mr. Kersey. I request a constable and a post horse to York. I will pay now." She pulled her purse from her sleeve and pressed coins into his wet hand before anyone could speak over her. Practical men trusted silver and specific words. The guard tried once more. "You can't just—" A rider came through the rain at a hard canter from the east road, cloak streaming. Westhaven's headgroom Halver reined in by the pole and took in the broken window, Barbara's torn glove, Bletchley bleeding from the wrist. "Miss McCarthy," he said sharply, "my lord sent me to watch the York turn. We lost your trace at the crossroads." "Found it now," Barbara said. "Can you ride me to York in under 3 hours?" "With a fresh mount, yes." She looked at Kersey. "Your best horse." Kersey glanced from her to Halver, to the crest on the coach door, to the gathering crowd that now smelled scandal and would remember every word. "You'll have him," he said. When the guard stepped forward again, Halver blocked him with his shoulder and said in a tone that ended debate, "You will remain here until the constable hears this. If you run, half these men will remember your face." Barbara swung into the saddle Kersey's boy brought, too high, too broad, but fast. Pain shot up her ankle. She ignored it. As she turned the horse toward the north road, she looked once at Bletchley. "Tell Lady McCarthy," Barbara said, rain running down her face, "that she has mistaken delay for victory." Then she kicked on. The assembly chamber in York smelled of wet wool, sealing wax, and men pretending neutrality. Barbara arrived at the side entrance with mud to her knees, hair half escaped, and Tom Kersey's signed road log in her glove. Halvor shoved through a knot of clerks. A beadle tried to bar the door until she gave her name, at which point his eyes widened and he waved them through with the horrified eagerness of a man sensing history. Inside, Mr. Lascelles stood at the long table reading from the forged codicil in his polished courtroom voice. Lady McCarthy sat near the front, Lucy beside her in a stiff blue frock, Mr. Crichton sprawling to one side with impatience written in every line of him. "And therefore management of the McCarthy estates shall vest," Barbara's voice cut across the room. "That instrument is fraudulent." Heads turned as one. Chairs scraped. Lascelles stopped mid-sentence, then arranged mild surprise. "Miss McCarthy," he said, "how relieved we are by your recovery. You were indisposed." "I was abducted." The word cracked through the chamber like dropped glass. Magistrate Hale, grey-browed and formidable at the dais, leaned forward. "Who speaks? Step into the well, miss." Barbara walked down the centre aisle, each step sending a flare through her ankle, and stopped at the table. She set down 3 things in a row: the certified copy packet with parish seal, Westhaven's memorandum copy, and Kersey's rain-spotted road log. "I am Barbara McCarthy," she said, "daughter of James McCarthy. I challenge this codicil's validity and request immediate examination of original estate ledgers and associated documents currently in Mr. Lascelles's possession." Lascelles smiled thinly. "The young lady is distressed. She removed papers unlawfully from her late father's study and has already acknowledged as much in writing." He produced her signed confession and held it aloft like a banner. Barbara did not look away. "I signed under threat that my minor sister would be removed from county jurisdiction before hearing. The first version demanded signature in exchange for a 10-minute visit. The second altered terms. Ask anyone in the hall who carried those notes." A stir at the back, Jenkins, pale but upright, had come. Hale held out his hand. "Mr. Lascelles, the original documents, on the table." "My dear sir, procedure on the table." Colour climbed Lascelles' neck. He set his dispatch case down, snapped it open and laid out the ledgers, receipts, codicil. Barbara recognised her father's blue ribbon packet and felt her lungs unlock for the first time since breakfast. Lady McCarthy rose half an inch. "This is outrageous. Must we indulge every melodrama from a grieving girl?" Barbara turned to her, voice quiet enough that people leaned in. "You called me girl at my father's grave. Today I am the only person in this room who can recite your theft by column and date." She placed her fingertips on the left ledger. "Rent roll, Michaelmas, quarter, tenant Elias Brigg, holding 9. In official book, 6 months arrears. In duplicate, paid in full, receipt 1,842, initialed JMC. Receipt exists in this packet." She lifted it. Mr. Brigg was threatened with eviction in January for debt he did not owe. She moved to the next page. Tenant widow Harcourt. 2 ewes remitted for flood damage. In official book, remission doubled and coin withdrawn for repairs. Repairs never performed. Her roof still leaks above the west cot. Murmurs spread. A clergyman near the wall frowned and nodded to himself. He had likely visited that roof. Lascelles cut in. "Even if discrepancies exist, they prove clerical error, not fraud." Barbara looked at him directly. "Then let us discuss handwriting." She held up the codicil. "My father's signature always drops the final stroke of the Y when he is weak. Here it rises. His capital M has a blunt middle peak. Here it is, pointed and overlong. This was written during the week. His laudanum dose reached 40 drops every 4 hours. Speculation, Lascelles said. Not speculation. Apothecary ledger. At Hale's nod, a narrow young man stepped from the benches, clutching a bound shop book to his chest. Mr. Finch, apprentice to the apothecary. Hands shaking, he read entries. James McCarthy, Esquire, tincture laudanum, 14 February, 16 February, 18, double quantity by order, carried from Hall. Lascelles pounced. By whose written order? Finch swallowed. By verbal order from Lady McCarthy's housekeeper and later from Lady McCarthy herself. Lady McCarthy laughed, brittle and bright. Are we hanging gentlewomen on apprentice memories now? Barbara did not flinch. No, on arithmetic. She turned pages fast, exact. Here, estate cash book shows £400 transferred for coal purchases in March. Coal invoices show £117 delivered. Difference appears same week as 3 sealed coin packets delivered after midnight to Mr. Lascelles' office by stable hand Ned Pike. A door at the rear opened. Ned entered on a crutch, arms still bandaged, with Westhaven just behind him and a constable at their shoulder. Relief hit Barbara so hard she nearly swayed. She locked her knees and kept speaking. Ned Pike, did you carry packets? Ned stared at the floor. Westhaven did not touch him, only stood where the boy could see him and not Lady McCarthy. Hale said gently, Answer, lad. Yes, Ned whispered. Then louder, Yes, sir, for months. Mrs. Bletchley gave 'em. Sometimes coin, sometimes papers, to Mr. Lascelles' clerk, if he weren't in. Lascelles snapped. A burned stable boy coached by me, Barbara said, because no one else bothered to ask him why he was scalded while your fires consumed ledgers. Crichton surged to his feet, red-faced. This is filth! I won't have my name tied to it. No one asked you to have any name tied to anything, Barbara said without looking at him. You were to be paid with me. That drew a hiss of shocked breath from the room. Lady McCarthy struck then, not with a fan, but with poison. She lies because she was passed over all her life, she said, voice carrying. Plain, resentful, hungry for notice. My husband pitied her, and she mistook pity for entitlement. Westhaven encourages her for sport. Enough! The single word came from Westhaven, low and lethal. He stepped forward, laid a sealed paper before Hale, and spoke to the dais, not to Lady McCarthy. Private memorandum by James McCarthy, dictated in my presence and signed during lucid interval, witnessed by Reverend Cole. It names me executor for purposes of safeguarding records if he died before audit. I delayed public action to secure proof. That proof is now before you. Lascelles saw the room tipping and made his final play. If your worship accepts this circus, then hear this also. He raised Barbara's confession again. She admits theft. She admits tampering. Every page she handles is compromised. Barbara drew breath, then chose the hardest thing. Total truth. Yes, she said. I took the box from my father's locked study because I had a note warning the papers would burn that night, and because by dawn they were being burned. I signed your confession because my sister was used as leverage. I am guilty of desperation, not forgery. She turned to Hale, voice steady. If protecting evidence from fire makes me thief, write it down, but read the numbers before you judge me. Silence. Hale reached for the duplicate ledger and read several lines himself, lips moving. Then he compared to the official book. His face closed. Mr. Lascelles, he said, how do you account for these inconsistencies? Lascelles' collar was damp. As I said, clerical. Under oath. For a second he tried to hold. Then his eyes flicked to Lady McCarthy, who stared back with flat command. Hold, hold, hold. He broke. I regularised entries, he muttered. Louder. I regularised entries at Lady McCarthy's instruction to preserve estate liquidity pending proper marriage alliances. His voice cracked. The codicil was drafted to prevent fragmentation of assets. Mr. McCarthy was uncooperative. A roar of voices rose. Hale pounded for order. Lady McCarthy stood very straight. He lies to save his neck. Lascelles rounded on her, panic now naked. You gave me your ring for the seal. You said the girl would sign anything once Crichton was set. Silence, Hale thundered. Constables moved. One took Lascelles by the elbow. Another approached Lady McCarthy. She did not collapse. She drew herself up with furious dignity and said to Barbara, each word a blade, You have ruined your own blood. Barbara met her gaze. No, I stopped you from spending it. Then she turned to Hale before the moment could curdle into spectacle. Sir, I petition immediate protective guardianship of my sister Lucy Ann McCarthy, pending Chancery ruling. She is 9. She has heard enough bargaining for one lifetime. Lucy had begun to cry silently, shoulders shaking. Barbara held out her hand. After one heartbeat, too, the child tore free of her chair and ran to her. Hale nodded once. Temporary guardianship granted pending formal order. Child to remain with Miss Barbara McCarthy under court protection. Mr. Crichton, you are dismissed from proceedings. Lady McCarthy, you will remain in county lodging under supervision until Chancery disposition. Crichton swore under his breath and shoved out, face mottled with outrage and unmistakable relief. Lady McCarthy did not look at Lucy as constables flanked her. She looked only at Barbara, and for the first time there was something like fear under the rage. The chamber emptied by degrees, noise draining into corridors and rain. Ink dried, wax cooled. Men who had watched in appetite now pretended they had watched in duty. Barbara sat on a bench outside the hearing room with Lucy asleep against her side, thumb tucked into Barbara's torn glove as if she were 5 again. Her ankle had swollen in her boot. Each pulse felt like a hammer tap. Her hands would not stop trembling now that they were no longer needed. Jenkins approached with 2 cups of thin tea and bowed awkwardly. Miss! Mr. Jenkins? Her voice rasped. He offered a folded scrap. Mrs. Talbot sent word through my cousin in town. She's at her sister's rooms near Stonegate. She asks if she may present herself when proper. Barbara closed her fingers over the note. Tell her she is wanted, with full wages owed. His eyes shone suddenly. Yes, miss. From farther down the corridor came Ned's uneven steps and Finch's nervous chatter. Westhaven was with them, speaking to a clerk about sworn statements, his tone clipped and practical, as if this had been an ordinary day's work. When he turned and saw her, something in his face changed. Relief, fierce and brief. Miss McCarthy, he said, you should have a surgeon see that ankle. I have had more pressing appointments. A corner of his mouth moved. So I observed. Lucy stirred, blinked up at him and whispered, Are you the lord who sent notes? Westhaven inclined his head solemnly. I am the lord who dislikes fire in libraries. Lucy considered this, then nodded approval and fell asleep again. Barbara looked at him over the child's dark head. You found Ned. He was in the county infirmary under a false fever transfer. Hale's order brought him out. Westhaven paused. You did the rest. I nearly lost everything at the crossroads. But you did not. He lowered his voice. When Kersey's boy reached me, he said you broke the carriage window with your own hand. I am sorry I was not there sooner. She surprised herself by answering honestly. I am glad you were not. If you had dragged me from that coach, they would have called it seduction and rescue. This way, they had to call it witness. Westhaven's gaze held hers. Yes. A clerk came to summon him for signatures. He hesitated, then said, Hale has ordered you and Lucy lodged tonight at my aunt's townhouse under her chaperonage, entirely proper, entirely guarded. Barbara almost laughed from pure exhausted disbelief. I should hope so. I have had enough of improper carriages for one day. When he left, she leaned her head back against the plaster and closed her eyes for 3 breaths. The world had not mended. Her father was still dead. Betrayal had still happened under her own roof, but the shape of power in that world had shifted, if only by inches, and the inches were hers. Spring came late, with crocuses pushing through a crust of old frost in the south garden at McCarthy Hall. Barbara stood at the morning room desk where her father had once corrected her sums and signed the final chancery packet that restored the original will, voided the forged codicil, and set Lady McCarthy's reduced annuity under supervision in Bath. Ink glistened black. Her signature lay straight and unhurried at the bottom line. Across the room, Lucy recited French verbs to Mrs. Talbot, who had returned with trunk dignity and a fury toward late wages that had impressed even the bailiff. Ned, arm heeling stiffly, had taken a light post in the grain office where Burns mattered less than honesty. Finch had been promised sponsorship for full apothecary training if he continued to keep books as precisely as he had under pressure. Crichton had sent one final letter calling the county ungrateful and had not been answered. A card arrived on a silver tray just before noon. Lord Westhaven. Barbara told Talbot, please have tea in the south parlour, and if Lucy asks, yes, she may spy from the corridor for 5 minutes, and no longer. Talbot's mouth twitched. Very good, miss. Westhaven entered in dark blue, no decorations, hat in hand. Outside, light moved over the yew hedge and caught damp leaves like small mirrors. Miss McCarthy. Lord Westhaven. They both smiled faintly at the formality that had carried them through warlike weeks, and now felt like armour no one had ordered. He remained standing until she gestured him to the chair near the window. When tea had been poured and untouched, he set his cup down and said, without preamble, I did not come to discuss filings. Good, Barbara said. I have seen enough filings to last a decade. A breath. Then he met her eyes fully. At the funeral, he said, I kissed your hand as a signal. Not mourning, not flirtation, recognition. I saw a woman standing alone in a field of people content to let her be buried while still alive. I wanted you to know someone had seen it. Barbara's fingers tightened on the saucer. I know that now. I should also tell you what I failed to tell then. His voice remained even, but she heard strain under it. I admired you before any of this. In your father's library, you corrected my map scale without apology. Most people apologize before truth, where rank is involved. She looked down despite herself, a sudden warmth at her throat. You had shifted a river 2 miles. Yes, unforgivable. She laughed once, soft. His expression sobered. I am not an easy man, Barbara. It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed like a bell. I know discipline better than charm, silence better than comfort. War taught me to count losses before hopes. Sometimes I choose caution when courage would be kinder. He flexed his hand unconsciously, the old scar across knuckles pale in the spring light. During your case, I feared 2 things equally. Failing you by acting too soon and failing you by acting too late. I still do not know that I judged every hour correctly. You judged enough correctly for me to stand. You stood because you chose to. He leaned forward, the controlled Earl gone for a moment, just a man asking with no title shield. "I have no wish to rescue you. I wish to build with you if you will have it. I love you. With respect first, and then with everything else I have been too guarded to say." The room went very quiet. In the corridor outside, a floorboard creaked. Lucy at her sanctioned espionage post. Barbara set her cup aside before she dropped it. "I did not expect those words from you," she said, "nor I from myself once." She studied him, the stillness that was effort, not coldness, the honesty that had cost him. "Do you understand," she said slowly, "that I will keep this house's books myself? That the nursery schoolroom stays open for tenant girls even if county matrons call it eccentric? That Lucy is not to be exiled for convenience? That I will read every line of anything put before me, including a marriage settlement drafted by the cleverest barrister in London?" A real smile, unguarded this time. "I would be offended if you did less. And when I am impossible? I will likely be impossible as well. We shall negotiate like civilized enemies and dine afterward." She rose and went to the window, buying one breath, then two. In the glass she saw reflected the churchyard girl in wet bombazine, and this woman in morning light with ink on her fingers and choice in her own mouth. She turned back. "At the funeral," she said, "you said without words that I was not abandoned prey." "Yes. I am not prey now." She crossed to him and held out her hand, palm up, bare. "If I give you this, it is not because I need saving. It is because I choose you." He stood. For once his composure broke openly. Relief and something like wonder crossed his face. He took her hand with both of his and bowed his head over it, lips warm against her skin. "No mourning," he murmured. "No mourning," she agreed. When she lifted his face, she did it with her free hand under his jaw and kissed him first, brief and sure, before any Earl's caution could return. From the corridor came a muffled squeak and the thud of a child fleeing to report triumphantly to Mrs. Talbot. Westhaven laughed under his breath. "I appear to have an audience." "You will need to court all of us," Barbara said. "We are a formidable household." "I have survived artillery. I am prepared." "Do not be overconfident, Oliver." His name felt right in her mouth. He closed his eyes for one heartbeat at the sound of it, then opened them and said, "Then, Barbara McCarthy, may I have the honour of trying every day?" "Yes," she said, "you may." On a clear morning in June, the old nursery wing at McCarthy Hall smelled of chalk, soap, and summer dust. 8 tenant girls sat at scrubbed tables while Barbara wrote figures on a slate. Rents, yields, seed costs, practical arithmetic wrapped in story so they would remember. Lucy, solemn with importance, passed out copybooks. Mrs. Talbot pretended not to beam. "Again," Barbara said, "if wheat sells at—" A knock sounded at the open doorframe. Westhaven leaned there in riding clothes, hat tucked under one arm, listening with that same exact attention he had once given maps. Beside him stood Magistrate Hale on a call regarding estate boundaries, and Finch, now properly apprenticed, carrying a medical satchel twice as neat as before. One of the smallest girls whispered too loudly, "Is that the Lord?" Barbara answered without turning. "It is a gentleman waiting until lesson is done." Westhaven bowed slightly to the class and stayed where he was. After sums, she crossed the courtyard with Hale to inspect repaired tenant cottages funded from recovered rents. Widow Harcourt met them under her newly thatched eave and pressed Barbara's hands in both of hers without words. Ned, sleeves rolled, shouted grain tallies from the office window and did not flinch when strangers asked him questions. Jenkins, restored to full authority over the cellar, informed everyone equally that no one entered the south vault without logging the key. By noon, papers had been signed in the morning room, guardianship made permanent, settlement terms for Lady McCarthy's Bath annuity fixed with strict oversight, charitable trust established for the schoolroom. Barbara read every line aloud before she signed. Hale grunted approval. Westhaven watched with undisguised pride. In the afternoon she rode with Lucy to St. Jude's. The churchyard grass had grown over winter scars. Rain from last night still jewelled the ropes hung near the sexton's shed. At her father's grave, Barbara stood without bonnet in her hand, sunlight warm on her hair, and set down a small ledger wrapped in oilcloth, not to bury, only to show him she had brought the books into daylight at last. Lucy slipped her hand into Barbara's. "Do you miss him every day?" "Yes," Barbara said, "and I hear him every day when I sign anything." Behind them, footsteps approached and stopped at a respectful distance. Westhaven did not intrude, only waited until Barbara turned. Then he offered his arm for the walk back through the gate. At the lich gate she paused, looked once more at the rope hanging neatly coiled, remembered hemp burning her palms while she stood silent and diminished. This time she reached for Westhaven's hand first. He took it, not as consolation for grief, but as equal pledge in full sun, and together they walked down the path toward home.